Welcome. My name is Eric Friedman. I'm the Executive Director of the Mad River Valley Chamber of Commerce, and we are here today to discuss the COVID relief legislation that is currently being debated up in Montpelier. And I'd like to thank our local representatives from here in the Valley, Maxine, Grad, and Kari, Dolan. And we'd also like to thank Representative Charlie Kimbell from Woodstock, Vermont, who is here, and I believe he is the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee. So we really appreciate him taking the time to join us today. Also present for this meeting are members of our local business community, representing various sectors of our local economy. And I'd like to thank Peter MacLaren from the West Hill House Bed and Breakfast, Kurt Gruendling from the Waitsfield Champlain Valley Telecom, Willie Docto from the Moose Meadow Lodge, and Lisa Loomis from the Valley Reporter, all the news that's fit to print. And some others that maybe not so fit to print, but whatever. Our business community is reeling due to the current situation. When the COVID-19 crisis began in Vermont, the businesses in the hospitality industry in particular was asked to shutter their operations for the greater good of public health. As a Chamber of Commerce, we are, on behalf of our businesses, looking to make sure that this relief package is as broad and meaningful as possible to our businesses. Clearly, this is a very difficult and a complex issue for all involved. And the debate has brought up many questions from our business community. After listening to our members, I've taken the liberty of distilling the many questions that we received down to a manageable number for today's discussion. So let's get to it. I guess I'd like to start out. Kari Dolan, one of our reps, has some slides to share talking about some of the numbers involved with this legislation. Do you want to kind of start off with that, Kari?
Yes, I will. And thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. And for those that are listening and participating, know that we care deeply about our businesses and what they're going through, and our whole communities are going through. And this is a really important conversation. Things are very fluid at the legislature right now. Every day we're in session on the floor debating these issues, and so this is very timely as well. I put together just a few slides to set the stage, and then I would like to spend a majority of our time just answering the questions that folks have. And know that this is the beginning of the conversation. I see that this is an important issue and needs to be an ongoing conversation with you all. Okay, I just have 4 slides here just to set the stage. As you know, back in March, as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, federal act, it provided funds for states to recover, address the emergency situation with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. And those funds came to Vermont almost immediately, back at the end of March. And typically when funds come to the state, either self-generated within the state or federal funds, it has to go through a legislative process. And what we are able to do in terms of managing that is to use our joint fiscal office to be the fiduciary for these funds, and have actually established it into 3 buckets of funding. And so we have one that was set up for the administration to handle emergencies, and we set aside $75 million of the $1.25 billion the state of Vermont received to handle emergencies, to be able to enable the administration to nimbly address emergencies when the pandemic first arrived at our doorstep. We also are enabling the Joint Fiscal Office to do approvals up to $150 million. In that way, they can continue with our ability to address under this crisis where we have needs to be most effective at addressing the public health and safety issues around the state. The third bucket is what we call the appropriations bucket. And this is where we can use a component of the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or CRF, to enable us to target where we have needs for COVID recovery. And what I wanted to point out, even though there's about a $1 billion in that fund, there are some three issues that we had to deal with within that bucket. The first is understanding that we are trying to finish up our existing fiscal year 20 for the state. We have every year we go through a budget adjustment process, and we were required to address the COVID-related impacts within this current fiscal year from this last quarter in particular. And also contained in that we need to address is what we call the skinny bill, the first quarter of state fiscal year 2021. The fiscal year switches over at the end of June, so it's just in another week or two. And that contained in that bucket is how we can respond to our COVID-19 recovery efforts specific to that first quarter. And then hazard pay. There are strict federal guidelines on how we can use these funds, and the federal government was strict in terms of making sure that these funds are targeted to the first responders or medical providers. We know that there are businesses out there that we determined essential, and such as our grocery stores, for example, and other important businesses. But unfortunately, those were considered ineligible. We needed to just focus on the medical providers. Now, the reason why I mention these is that contained in both that bill dealing with budget adjustment in the first quarter are the dollars necessary to keep open University of Vermont, our state college network, and the Vermont Student Assistance Grant programs to help support our students as they attend colleges. We had to, for example, allow for refunds to families when schools shuttered, and ongoing efforts to install the right protection equipment and infrastructure in those schools is ongoing, and those are contained in those bills. I then want to just point out that there's a timeline here that we're dealing with. As I mentioned, the CARES Act was passed in March. And about 7 weeks later, we received the governor's plan. And the governor's plan was very high level. And I think Charlie will get into this a bit, and had two phases to that as well. And that is where the plan talked about buckets. And I'll show you an actual breakdown of that budget later, but that helps to guide the legislature and where they saw, in conjunction with the administration, where the priorities are. And hats off to, in particular, for the Commerce Committee, where Charlie sits, because in a very short time, in a 2-week time period, just over 2 weeks after receiving the governor's plan, we were able to get the first phase of funding out immediately for those hardest hit businesses. And we actually are taking up the second large bill now to deal with that second phase. So the legislature really tried to respond very quickly to once we were able to get the guidance from the federal government, which was slow coming, and the governor's plan. I want to then turn over this slide to Maxine, Grad, my fellow district mate, who will talk about some of the restrictions of this particular grant program.
Great, thank you. And
Maxine?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, we thought it was important to highlight that there are really a number of restrictions and requirements for expenditures, and it's quite strict. And we actually have a team at the Joint Fiscal Office that Kari referred to. They are a nonpartisan office that advises the legislature in terms of financial matters, and they really scrubbed any proposals to make sure that it would fit in with requirements. So, for example, the expenditures, they need to be necessary, incurred due to, or as a result of the public health emergency brought on by COVID. They were not accounted for in the budget most recently. They were incurred between March 1st and December 30th. They must be expended by December 30th. So that's very limiting for a number of items. Determined by the state to be of necessity, cannot be used as revenue replacement, and loans repaid after December 30th must be repaid to the U.S. Treasury and you must repay the U.S. Treasury for any purposes determined to be ineligible. So I just wanted really to emphasize that, that there are very strict requirements that we had to work under and will continue to work.
Thank you, Maxine. Thank you. I'm going to turn this slide over to Charlie, Representative Kimbell, who will talk about some of the existing programs so that people know that the CRF isn't the only opportunity in town. So Charlie.
Thank you, Kari. So I come into this as the ranking member on the House Commerce and Economic Development Committee. I'm also a small business owner, so I own a retail store, and as well as I'm the head of sales and marketing for a software development firm. But I live in Woodstock, and we are highly a tourism economy, much like the Mad River Valley. So I hear daily from constituents on the pain that they are suffering because their businesses are closed. So the first executive order was March 13th, when the governor said you had to limit your gatherings to, I think, 500 people initially, or maybe it was 250. And that there was a restriction on whether or not you could visit elder care facilities. And then over the series of 11 days, it continued to ratchet down what you were able to do until finally on May 24th, we had the stay home, stay safe order, which basically shut down the economy, especially the tourism business, all in the name of public health. So since then, it's been a gradual easing, but that doesn't make it easy. And I fully recognize the pain that you have as operators of lodging and hospitality businesses and trying to figure out how you're going to make it through this. So the federal programs, the PPP loans, the Paycheck Protection Loan, Vermont businesses received over $1.2 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans or grants that could be forgiven. And as you know, those the conditions around those have changed. It was you had to use, you could have forgiven up to if you use 75% of the proceeds of the loan for payroll, and that's been changed now to 60%, but it's binary. It's if you don't reach 60%, you can't write it off. Whereas before it was scaling up to 75%. And the other part is that instead of 8 weeks in which to incur those expenses, now you have 24 weeks to incur those expenses to try to get them written off. So that is better, but we know that as people are trying to come out of the woods, from not being open to being open, you're not going to have the revenue stream or not being able to keep the staff members on board. So it's still not perfect as a vehicle. The economic injury disaster loans were stood up quickly, also with the advances that were made. And I think there's over 114 million, I can't remember the exact amount, and about 29 million in economic injury disaster loan advances, which were not repayable. So those have not been as popular as the PPP loans. The thing about the PPP loans is that a lot of businesses took them out that didn't necessarily need it. They didn't necessarily suffer economic harm at that point, but they took it because they might at some point. Others have kept it in the bank because the prospect of having to pay it all back or not being able to have it forgiven wasn't great. So then the other stuff that's on the screen that Kari has here is the economic impact checks of $1,200 that went to consumers based on their tax returns that they had filed, did run into people's pockets. And also there's two things: the federal pandemic unemployment compensation, which is the extra $600 per week benefit amount for folks who are unemployed, plus the pandemic unemployment assistance, which was offered to people that not originally eligible for unemployment insurance. So if you're self-employed or if you're short-time employment history or not enough earnings. So those were the conditions in which PUA basically was stood up. And 107,000 Vermonters have filed initial claims on unemployment insurance, which is dramatic. A typical year is in the 40s. So that's to have that amount in 4 or 5 weeks is just overwhelming, as was the Department of Labor. There are various programs that were launched underneath the CARES Act. There were 3 different acts. The CARES Act was the last one that set up the $1 trillion in benefits, but there are other things that I don't know that many businesses have taken advantage of in terms of being able to take advantage of the employee retention tax credits or some of the other things for paid sick leave and whatnot. And then also the SBA did pay for, on any SBA guaranteed loans, 6 months worth of payments which is amazing, whether or not you declared whether you suffered or not. And the other is on VITA loans. They also offered 6 months deferred payments as well. And so there's a big slug of companies or businesses that are in the hospitality industry that have taken out VITA loans as well. So that's kind of the cover of that. I didn't know, Kari, if you wanted me to just cover what the $70 million was that we approved last week. And
Yes.
then,
Yeah, let me pull up the spreadsheet that I have prepared. It is in draft form. It's, as I mentioned, it's fluid, but at least gives you a kind of an overall sense of where we've been spending our time. Let me pull that up.
And I'll just talk to it before you pull it up too, and that's, I get lost in spreadsheets, so I just want to
I'll
cover
highlight.
a couple things. Yeah, Kari's done a great job of documenting all of this. Right, so the governor's column is governor phase 1, governor phase 2, and then legislature phase 1, phase 2, and then comments about it. And we made a mistake as a legislature by following normal protocol, which is the governor prepares a budget and the legislature reacts. So that is basically what happened with the spending of the coronavirus relief fund. The governor made a proposal and then we reacted and came up with something different. Some of what the governor proposed, we can't do because we can't use the funds that way. And we found out that businesses did not want loans, they needed grants. They could not take on additional debt. Like, okay, so we in the Commerce Committee tried to reconfigure what that package looked like. We found out that we couldn't use on line 4 there, we couldn't use coronavirus fund for long-term loan, for a loan fund. That everything had to be paid back to the federal government. So it wasn't that if somebody paid back the loan to VITA, that VITA would be able to keep it and relend it again. That was not a permissible use.
Can I interrupt for just 1 second?
Yeah.
Sorry, stop tinkering with your screen. It's really hard to read as you make boxes bold and things. It's really hard to follow along. Okay, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Correct. So on line 4, right, the $42,400,000 was loans, and also included loan loss reserves. The $30 million was grants that would be administered by VITA, but you had to apply for a loan in order to get it. VITA was going to be paid $1.8 million in order to administer the fee, and $5.8 million was interest forgiveness on VITA loans only. $100 million was in grants administered by the Department of Tax, and $20 million was a mix of things. The $100 million, let me just say that the Agency of Commerce and Community Development is trying to stand up a grant program which they've never administered, the kind of which they're looking to administer. And so they're looking for how can we get out the most amount of money possible in the shortest period of time without creating a painful waiting period. So that was what ACCD is really trying to do. So what they did is they looked at a couple of things. One is, how can we partner with somebody inside the state government in order to get those funds out the door? So they chose tax. Tax has the systems, and also for anybody who pays sales and use tax and also purchase and sales tax. Rooms and meals and sales and use tax. Anybody who pays those, tax can verify what they've paid and what the decrease has been. So they came up with a proposal saying, if you show me a decrease in revenue of at least 50% in the months between March 1st and September 1st from the previous year, then we'll give you a grant, we'll administer a grant. By standing up an application that fills in the boxes, then they can use that information, verify it against tax records, and then issue a check. Once they have that process set up, they were looking at processing it inside of a day from the time that they received the application. Now that's amazing. So that's what they were trying to do, and we worked with the commissioner of the tax department, who's actually a geek by profession. He'll admit to that, being a real nerd. And he said, yes, we can write this program for this application and get this money out the door that quickly. And they're still saying they can do it. So anyway, that's why they chose tax and that's for businesses that do file those taxes. For everybody else, those businesses that could have suffered a loss, they came up with this $20 million program on Restart Vermont Loan Guarantee Program, and also that $30 million through VITA. But that $20 million was going to require a lot of interviews with the businesses to figure out what their loss was, and paired them up with revolving loan funds and regional development corporations, using a mix of loan guarantees, some grants, and it became very complicated. So we tried to work with them to simplify that and say, you know what, it's going to take us 3 months to go through this process just to figure out the details of the program. And that's what a typical legislative process is. So we said, let's get $70 million out the door, let tax and ACCD figure it out. So that's what we passed in the first slug of financing, which is $70 million, $50 million for those businesses that file rooms and meals or sales and use tax, and $20 million for those companies that don't. So that was the first slug of financing, was that $70 million. Then today, we approved another $70,200,000 to go into that same channel. And that's on line 10 here in column E. So between those two, that's $140,200,000. But there's also a number of things that we listed with, that we worked with various advocates and people with inside the executive branch to figure out how else can we get money out to those people that are most in need. Oh, for instance, I forgot to back up. The $70 million was for those businesses that had suffered at least 75% or more in revenue loss. The second piece now is 50% or more. So because there might be some folks like a restaurant that had been doing curbside, and it's not a total loss, but they've been able to, maybe 60% of revenues. Well, they're not in the first tranche, they're in the second tranche. So that's what we're trying to do, is those businesses that are in most need can get the money first, and then the other businesses. Then there's a whole bunch of people on here, and it's a mix of grants and a mix of administrative help. So the economic recovery grants women and minority-owned businesses. If a business is owned 51% by a woman or a minority, is using a form that's completed by the Buildings and Ground Services, Buildings and General Services, then they would qualify for a grant of up to $10,000. And this was to really carve out from the general program those who generally don't always get, SBA calls them disadvantaged applicants. They may not have relationships with banks at the time. So it's really to create that additional avenue for those populations that aren't traditionally banked. The highway contractors is a carve out from our transportation committee, and this is part of politics. They said, how can we help the people that are working on, thank you, Kari, that are working on highway, bridge, and road construction. And as long as they still have to have suffered a 75% loss in this group between March 1st and September 1st. The next line is $1.5 million for outdoor recreation businesses, and this is not grants to them for their recovery. This is for them to make it safe for people to participate in the outdoor recreation business. So it could be for personal protection equipment. It could be for sanitizing. It could be for reconfiguring a parking area or spacing. And it's going to be administered by the Agency of Natural Resources. So that was today, we voted on that. The economic recovery grants for the creative economies, $5 million. We heard from people all over the state that are in the performing arts and other cultural organizations that are saying their need was $50 million. So we carved out $5 million to be administered by the Vermont Council on the Arts to go to nonprofits that have experienced a loss of 50% or more in that same time period. And that's not to be confused with charitable donations. So it's mostly programming. The next one is $5 million on line 15. This is very creative. It's how to engage restaurants. The restaurants may have received a grant or they may have received a loan, but this is $5 million that working in coordination with a group of stakeholders. This is the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development. This is Hunger Free Vermont. It's a restaurant group. The Skinny Pancake has stood up one of these particular programs, and it's to set up 12 hubs around the state and engage restaurants that may be sitting idle, maybe partially idle. and then to provide food to them and pay them for that food to then distribute to people who are food insecure. So this is a win-win-win we look at in that sense, because we've got restaurants that are now doing something, buying food from local farmers and local producers, and then giving it to the homeless. I'm sorry, not the homeless, the food insecure. And right now, that statistic is a scary 46% of Vermonters are considered to be food insecure. That's an alarming statistic. The next $1 million is for Better Places. And this is money that is to enable communities, downtowns, village centers, whatever they are, in order to either get some kind of equipment to make it possible to do business in the COVID world. And that could be outside tents, it could be barricades, it could be other stuff that helps social distancing, but still continue to operate and stay in business and to actually re-engage. So that's $1 million. It was a $5 million ask. The $3 million below that is for a technical network. And I'm sorry, Craig, if I'm going on too long, you can just tell me to stop. Eric, sorry.
No, I appreciate this. I think it's really good background, and I think some of the questions that we have, like I said, the example, the first question that we have was, as we understand it, the governor requested $200 million for business grants, and that number has been reduced. The legislature appropriated $70 million last week, and will appropriate that much again this week. And if it isn't allocated to business relief as the governor requested, what's the money going to be used for?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this does explain a lot of it, because a lot of it, not all of it. So the Restart Vermont Technical Assistance Network, this is to provide technical assistance to businesses to figure out how they can pivot from what they're doing currently and restart in a way that makes sense for them. If it's a restaurant, how do you set up curbside? How do you do takeout? A lot of people have figured that out already, but there might be some legal things necessary. There might be some online assistance that's necessary. So this is to provide money to pay for those consultants to help businesses actually reconfigure what they're doing. That's $3 million. The next one is a marketing campaign. We had a request for $5 million. It had a mix of things. It had a program that was a consumer stimulus concept of giving people money on a gift card, where if a consumer contributed $10, the fund would kick an additional 10, so double their money to be used at a local business. We worked through the details of that and found it to really be administratively unworkable as we were going through it. And then there's also the idea of regional regional marketing programs for businesses that would divide the state into 7 different regions. We were kind of lukewarm on that, but we really recognize the need for marketing assets and assistance to businesses to market their own services, their own products when they're ready to reopen. So we said, let's cut them some leeway here and let's approve $3 million for those businesses for the marketing department to be able to gauge that way. The next one is $5 million for the Working Lands Enterprise Fund. And these funds are intended to help those businesses who are working on the land, and they could be agriculture, it could be forest products industries. And that is to help them recover from the financial impact that COVID has had on them, as well as, again, pivot towards different markets. So there could be a dairy farmer that wants to then not just be in the raw milk business, sale of raw milk, but also make cheese or cottage cheese or maybe yogurt. But they have to scale up and they have to buy equipment, they have to do a lot of things in order to make that pivot. And I use that just as one example, but that's not by and large what it is. So that's $5 million. And we had testimony from them that they did have some leftover funds where they opened up an RFP for 10 days, received $1.4 million of applications, and they were able to make grants of $250,000 inside of 10 days. So we know that they have the ability to put this money out. So that's the area that I'm most familiar with and comfortable in terms of what my committee has been working on. And the rest of it, I would leave to Kari, just to put her on the spot, because it's kind of fun. But you know, and I was looking at what we approved today is, in addition to the $70 million that we did last week, the variety of the programs, whether it's the women and minority-owned businesses, the highway contractors, the creative economy, we look at all those, that's at $88 million today. And so when the $70 million and the $88 million, you're up to $158 million for what the legislature approved in grants. That far exceeds what the administration was going to propose for grants. Remember, they had a mix of loans. And then the other investments have been significant, especially in broadband, $68 million. That's huge. So that tells you where some of the investment decisions of the legislature have been instead. And with that, I'll stop talking.
Thanks, Charlie. I appreciate that. Do any of our representatives from the business community have any follow-up questions about that?
Can I ask one quick one, Eric, just while we're on that broadband investment in terms of what ended up in that 68 that was approved? I know a lot of it was going to schools, some low-income reimbursement. I know there were some challenges in terms of allocating that to physical infrastructure and fiber optics, where really, obviously a good portion, that's where we've been behind for the last 20 plus years in terms of what the state of Vermont has actually been funding in terms of physical infrastructure and fiber optics.
I could take a stab, but then I would lean on my cohorts. You're right in that it all had to be spent by December 30th of this year. And so if we couldn't spend it by December 30th, we couldn't use it. So it's a mix of finance, a mix of expenditures. Some of it is fixed wireless. Some of it is just line extension. Kari, you might have the numbers better than me, but I have some of the numbers written in my book, but I don't know if you have them broken out in your spreadsheet.
I have it in another spreadsheet, so I could get you that information. I could pull it up now, but we would lose this cover. So
yeah, no worries. I want to continue the conversation. I know you guys have been talking with Roger as well, so I don't want to take the focus just when we're on that. If you knew quickly, so why don't we, Eric? I'm good. We can.
Yeah.
Can I just give you the numbers then?
The number is 43 million here. Although the governor had in their phase 2 about 20 million, I think the real importance here is that we're within the order of magnitude, and we both recognize how critically important it is for both telemedicine, teleschool, teleeducation, and telework. And yet the COVID-19 pandemic really exposed to us where we have areas across the state in every community where we have inequities in terms of coverage. And so we both the administration and the legislature realized that this was a really important opportunity. But what really helped to kind of congeal around the dollar amount, it was how much can we actually get expended by December. So we know that this is a down payment, not exactly going to solve all our broadband needs, but it's a real important initiative to see what we can accomplish within this current calendar year.
I'm
happy to see the reprioritization, and we all know, right? It's a leveler for people, right? It's and it's a time and money equation. It's going to take time, even if all the money was available to build everything tomorrow, right? It's going to take years.
Mm-hmm.
So I have some numbers for you. So of the 43 million, 15.6 million is going to the Department of Public Service. 11 million was to the Get Vermonters Connected Now initiative. $2 million is a line extension customer assistance program. And I have to look back through my notes to know exactly what that is. That, I believe, is to at least get people up to a 25.3. And any one of these situations is to get people to a minimum of a 25.3 broadband. Let's see, those are small amounts. $20 million to the Public Utilities Commission to pay for arrearages. When we passed legislation back in March, I believe it was, that restricted utilities from disconnecting people because they hadn't paid. Well, the accumulated deficit of that part is $20 million. And then there was, to the Agency of Digital Services, there's a number of expenditures in there as well. So that's the 7.35 million there. So that's part of it anyway.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Charlie, I did have a question just on legislative process. Certainly appreciate the updates of what's been passed today. But from when it has passed, including what was passed last week, when does it actually become available for the appropriate departments to start processing the grants?
So with a $70 million slug of money that we voted on last week, it said the agency had 10 days in which to set up the procedures and also to put it in place from the time it was signed into law. So at this point, as of last night, the governor had not signed it yet. But at the same time, I know that the Agency of Commerce and Community Development and the Department of Tax is already working on the form and on the process. So that's on the part that you would be eligible for because you collect rooms and meals tax. And that's the one that's automated. So if you file on a monthly or quarterly basis, then you're eligible for that particular $50 million slug of money in that first group. 20 million is through the regional partners that ACCD is recognizing. So I would say it's probably a week and a half from now from the time that the application is going to be available.
Thanks, Charlie. One of the inconsistencies that we keep hearing from the governor is that I think as recently as Wednesday, he said he had not actually seen last week's legislation across his desk to sign it yet, but he was expecting to sign it when he got it. Can you give us an update on that?
I actually don't know where it is because Maxine, and you probably know better than us in terms of when the governor does get a bill, he has his attorneys go through it to view it to make sure it's consistent with law and then signs it when he's been given the green light. Is that right?
Well, he has 5 days. Yeah, five days once it is delivered to him to either sign it, veto it, or let it go into law without his signature.
Okay. I'm sorry, did someone else have another question?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I had more questions about the phase 2 part, but there was something Charlie said about the phase 1. So the 70 million is split between a $50 million grant and then 20 million is given to regional partners. Who are those regional partners?
Yeah, and I might have said that wrong. So it is all 70 million in grants, but the first 50 million is administered by Agency of Commerce and Community Development with the Department of Tax. The other 20 million is administered by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development in concert with regional partners. And we left the door open to them to figure out who that was. It's most likely their regional development corporations, but VEDA also, Vermont Economic Development Authority, also could be a player in that. And here's the issue, is that it's easy, should back up a second. Remember, speed versus being able to create a perfect program. And with speed, you get the tax department because you can get that verifiable. Without the benefit of somebody filing their monthly or quarterly sales tax reports, you can't verify what their income is easily. Tax can't, because it could be a Schedule C company, it could be a corporation, it could be any form where that sales figure is not going to be obvious. And so it takes somebody to sit down and review that information. And so it's a slow process. So we said, go ahead, work with your regional partners. They can help you in a decentralized environment using a common application form and speeding up the process. So that's what that is.
All right, so there's no group of 7 regional partners that's defined. It's up to the ACCD to decide how to work with that 20 million.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Okay. Can I ask my phase 2 questions, or should we wait until the phase 1 questions are done?
Sure.
Okay. So the minority-owned business grants, I being a minority, I really appreciate the effort that the legislature is making to encourage women and minority-owned businesses. A slight issue that you may want to consider is that 51% ownership. My husband and I own our business 50-50. So I would, according to this, bill, I would not qualify for any assistance if I applied. What you might consider is perhaps taking a business with a partnership of less than 5 partners, and then saying if it's 50% owned by minorities, then they would qualify. So take 50% ownership up to 4 partners. That way, if there's 5 partners, 3 of those partners need to be minority in order to be a majority partnership. But if there's only 2 or 4 partners and half of them are minority, then they would not be eligible to apply. You see? They're missing that 1%.
Yeah.
So just something to think about.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the Restart promotional program. So the governor wanted to give out money distributed to different regional partners via an application where they could take these gift cards and sell them basically or give them to, I don't know, whether to give them or sell them for half the price, and then the business would redeem it for the full price and get half of it, or get the full value of the card, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
I'm a little confused. Anyway, were you saying that with your now $3 million budget for that the legislature is not supporting the regional partnership idea, or are you just letting the state handle the distribution of those gift cards?
Yeah, the sentiment of our committee was that it didn't make sense to work with regional partnerships, to be honest, and that the gift card had some serious flaws in terms of how it would be administered and also extreme overhead expenses. So we talked to somebody who was going to develop an app that you could use and only at participating retailers. And that app would, the estimate that we were given was $500,000 to create it. It seems crazy. And then we had somebody else say it cost $40,000 to set up the system. Like, all right, well, that's more reasonable based on $5 million. But so when we looked at that, we didn't want to specify as to whether or not we were going to force the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to utilize regional partnerships the way that they did it. The problem is that from our perspective is that you combined Windsor and Windham County, for instance, and Rutland and Addison County. And it's not necessarily natural partnerships. It might be, but those organizations don't yet exist. If the Agency of Commerce and Community Development figures out a way to do it effectively to market those regional businesses, okay, great. Then it's up to them. We had testimony from Stephen Wright up at JPEAK, and he said, listen, we need help now. We need help putting together a marketing program now. I mean, it would really help if people could visit here freely. That's the best marketing program that we could have. And that's not us. That's not us. That's the governor. But so we did not specify that they had to spend it in any particular way. Okay. But we also encourage them to utilize their own internal talent, which they have a lot of at the Department of Tourism and Marketing, to create marketing assets that can be used by a business or used by regional partners and advertising. So that was our preference.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you talking about that that particular program, because, you know, as a person that's been involved in the Vermont tourism industry and as a marketing professional for, you know, going on 30 years, I was really stunned by the numbers, because we were talking about initially $5 million to market to 600,000 Vermonters, when we used to, you know, normally we spend about half of that to reach the entire Northeast megalopolis and the entire world. And, you know, far be it from me as a marketing person to not take money. But my inclination was to give the damn $5 million to the businesses. It's not a marketing problem right now. And, you know, the people want to come here. They can't come here. So marketing seems absurd to me. And, you know, I just wanted to put that out there. And, you know, all the professionals that I've talked to have said the same thing. And my colleagues with the other chamber executives, the Vermont Association of Chamber Executives, we were pretty much in lockstep with that. And again, we're not the ones that would normally turn away marketing money.
And you have to go back to what ACCD was trying to figure out. So they conducted all these different interviews, and they're trying to be holistic by saying, we're going to provide grants to businesses who are suffering to try to withstand the economic shock that they're going through, number one. Number two, we're going to help them help them with some kind of technical assistance if they have to change how they do business. And number three, once they've done that and they're ready to reopen, we want to provide them with some help in remarketing. So they're trying to be a whole approach, very encompassing, and that's why they came out with the program the way they did. We had the same reaction. When you have 1,000 cars that are lining up at the Middlebury Airport to get free meals, what are you going to market? To Vermonters who are lining up in cars to get free MREs? That did not make sense to us. So we said, you know what? We know you have something there, but we're going to let you develop what it is, and we're not sure what that is. Yeah, their annual budget is $3 million in a normal year. So it's added $3 million to it.
Yeah, one of the questions, or a lot of the questions we have that I've received from our business community, is a lot about the rules, and I understand that there's a lot of hoops to jump through for sure, but it seems as though the legislature seems keen to define who the winners and losers are, and for example, the 75%. 50% threshold, things like that. And we're really glad to see that was altered a bit in this latest round. But there are things like the sole proprietorships. Many lodging properties operate as partnerships with owners not taking wages as such and have no employees. So as such, they have no Vermont-based employees, and apparently that's what's required in the proposed rules, so that they can't access state funding while they're hurting financially, just as much as businesses organized as corporations. I think one of the things that we're curious about is, what's the rationale for that?
We are on camera, right? To be totally candid with you, the administration told us they did not want to have sole proprietors and slugs of financing. And believe us, we do not want to pick who wins and who loses, who gets money and who doesn't. Not at all. We don't want to be in that business. So when we said, how do we divvy it up? So we need to help the businesses that have been hurt the most. And that the only way for us to do that was we need to create a higher threshold than a 50% loss in revenue of any 1 month. That's why the first 70 million was limited to that. But the intent all along was to go down to the 50% with the second slug of financing. The other thing is, if you apply for money in the 70 million with a 75% requirement, and there's no money left, you're automatically first in line for the next slug of money. So it's not like you have to reapply. It's nothing else. You've already met that 50% requirement. You're good to go there. We also don't know, honestly, as to how many people are going to be in that $20 million and how many people are going to be in the $70 million. It could be that there's more applying for 20 million than there is for the 70. And so that's why the second group of money, the 70,200,000, is up to the agency to ask the Joint Fiscal Committee of the legislature for permission to allocate it in a way that meets the most demand based on what they've realized.
And are there any timing on the rules for the second? I mean, how will businesses that do not pay sales tax access some of these funds? I see you've carved out funding for such businesses, but what's the timing for such businesses? For the plow guys and the cleaning businesses and the contractors, where's their relief? The newspapers. Newspapers.
Yeah, it's going to be set up at the same time, Lisa. So it's so the $20 million in that program is going to be stood up simultaneously with the $50 million for those people that do pay sales taxes and rooms and meals taxes. So that with the 75, with the requirement they've had a revenue decrease of 75% or more. The next chunk of money, the 70,200,000, we didn't specify a date by which they had to come up with it, but the agency is going to have all of the process established by that time, and there's no reason to wait.
And as a follow-up, if you cannot show you lost 75% of your revenue, and you apply and you're rejected, are you then still in the queue for the next pile of money that is based on 50% loss of revenue?
Yeah, those details are being worked out, but we asked the Commissioner of Taxes if they would just keep the application on file, and he said, yes, we would.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've heard from local businesses is their frustration with that was that as things closed down, they tried to do the right thing and stay open and keep their business, keep their employees working, and knowing that they weren't going to be able to be profitable, but knowing that they wanted to keep their employees on, and it boosted their revenue, and now they feel like they're getting screwed because they did the right thing.
Yeah, and it's at that time, businesses had to make all sorts of decisions. If you were a market and you were allowed to stay open, but you're really nervous, would you close? So some businesses that did have the opportunity to stay open chose to close. Then there was the question of whether or not you should take a PPP loan or you put your people on unemployment. So in order to keep them on your payroll and to be earning more than they could earn on unemployment, then you'd have to increase their pay. Could you do that? Did that make sense? How long did you have? So there are a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty in that whole process. Absolutely. And it's been very frustrating. Remember, this is all in reaction to a pandemic, and none of it was intentional from that aspect.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things, going back a little bit, I've been I think a lot of people are under the impression, and they've certainly heard, you know, I know I heard from, I think it was Maxine or Kari, you know, in conversations in the last week, that some funds were being reserved for shortfalls in the education funding. Is that true?
I'm going to defer to my colleagues.
So I can jump in, and then Kari or Charlie, if you add anything more. So we are holding money back in case, well, first, if the rules change. So right now, you know, they're, like you said, they're very, you know, strict restrictions, and one of them is in terms of education funding. And you know, if that changes and there's some way that we can help with the education fund and not put the burden on the property taxes, that's something that we would consider. Also, you know, we're waiting for our revenues to come in and to understand really what the needs are, and there may be needs that are changing. And so again, if the rules change or there are needs that we didn't anticipate, felt it was a prudent thing to do was to hold money back.
Okay. Yeah. That being said, that if, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mac.
I was just going to add one more consideration on that. Our thinking was that if we were going to experience a second wave, for example, and I know there's a question whether we're out of the first wave, but that might have triggered some additional need when there's no additional dollars, and so that too fed into the thinking of why to set aside some until August when we get back together and finish the budget.
You know, if this
Our overall intent is not to send any money back to the Treasury.
If assuming that, you know, I can appreciate, you know, the education issue, but if businesses go under, won't there just be less revenue in the futures, and how will that be accounted for? Won't property taxes and other taxes just go up next year if these businesses go under and there's a lack of revenue there?
Yeah, that's always a question. And then, so we just need better data. So I think the package that we've put out already is really intended to help those businesses who have suffered the most, and also help their workers by being able to get back to work at some point. So that I understand where you're coming from is why wait? Why not get the money out now? And the reality is that we're getting as much out now as we can quickly. I mean, to think that how fast we've done this amount of legislating is incredible. And I think it was 14 days from the time that we got the administration's proposal for phase one until getting $70 million or $93 million out the door. That's faster than the Vermont legislature has ever acted in trying to react to that.
So
Well,
the business, obviously, I'm sorry, Lisa, did you have a question?
well, it's not out the door. I think we're still 10 days away from the application process, right?
No, you're right in that sense. I'm sorry, it's not in people's hands yet. But in terms of getting anything through the legislature that fast, for us, out the door means to the governor. So that's what we've been focused on, is how do we get this into policy and into practice.
And a couple of things I'd like to just point out too, that we're on the spreadsheet, but we, I think having this conversation is important. But to point out that in order for businesses to be open, or to even schools to be open, what are we doing about quality daycare and school programs and after school programs? There's $9 million of that Corona Relief Fund to support those types of businesses that are providing for our working families. The other important line item in there is about $256 million to support our medical, our hospitals, our community hospitals, our clinics, our dental offices, our independent medical offices. And all that was to recognize that's an important business sector that we, in fact, have contained in our district that we need to be able to support, because the COVID-19 really cleared the decks to been able to have our hospitals be able to respond to the pandemic, but now there's some substantial hurting in our in this component of our business sector.
Thank you. One of the things
Eric.
I've noticed, I'm sorry, did someone have a question?
No, Eric, I was just going to say, one of the challenges, and thank you for, I know this, none of this was planned. This is stuff that you've been working on very quickly, trying to get and stand up these programs. And I know that's not easy with all this stuff coming at you in many different directions. Eric, I know you and I are talking to businesses each and every day, and I'm sure, all of you are as well. And, one of the challenges of, those that aren't open today, the uncertainty of not knowing when they're going to be able to open, and some just, throwing in the towel. Others that obviously, thought this might only last, a couple weeks, a couple months, here we are, and there's still, that lack of certainty that's critical and essential to businesses, and obviously not knowing what the tourism season is going to be, if any. And, so the longer this goes on, I think, we're going to see more and more businesses that just can't make a go at it, or it's, too stressful, or all the uncertainty, that they keep digging into their own pockets to try to, keep people, the lights on and, employees there. But, at some point, they're just not going to make it. And Eric, I know you've talked to, some even just today that are telling you exactly that. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Kurt. I literally had a conversation at about 3 o'clock today to two business owners right on Bridge Street in downtown, saying that they're within a week. They can't operate after another week or so. And his comment to me is, Eric, where the hell's the money? Like, that's what we need to know. So our business community is really hurting. We're talking about very draconian sorts of cuts that business owners are making on a daily basis, and decisions that are really, really difficult. Remarkably, this week, here in our local school district, we passed a education budget quite overwhelmingly, actually, with a 2% increase or somewhere in that neighborhood. I'd like to know what kinds of cuts in education and in the government are going to be talked about to even the pain a little bit here, because I was shocked. I've never voted no on a school budget in my life. And to know that we're increasing a budget, and while the business community is hurting, I think it's unconscionable. And I really hope that the government and the education sector is looking at this in the same way. And I'm not sure if that's a question. I guess it is to our reps, is, what is government looking at in terms of spending cuts? What is, and in education, we can't just keep going on and putting the burden on taxpayers.
You're right. We do need to be thinking about this across all sectors, know that education funding is managed on a statewide basis, but there are basically the state education fund is made up of decisions made at school districts across the state. And we had, as you know, when COVID-19 hit, we had just a month or two of the remaining fiscal year to be able to determine what that education fund is going to look like and set that rate. And that was already at a time where 115 plus school districts had already approved their budget. So yes, the budget passed for our district, and that is to handle what the budget's going to look like for fiscal year 21. The towns need to have certainty, the schools, and 80% of those budgets are staff. And there needs to be some certainty at the school level to know that when kids come back, there are teachers and programs there in place. The big decisions will happen at that school board level in the following years, fiscal year 22, 23, 24, where it's going to be up to that school budget, listening to the folks that make up that school district to determine what those budgets look like. And you're right, and that's one sector. Across the board, I know that this is going to be a very difficult budget season and for the next few years to be able to recover from this pandemic. And you're right, we have to make some really difficult decisions moving forward. And this is why we had right now are passing what we call the skinny bill, just dealing with the first quarter, because there's still a lot of uncertainty related to what our budget forecasts will look like. And Vermont, although may not have a constitutional requirement to balance a budget, we've always been very fiscally responsible when it comes to looking at our budgets and managing within our means. And that's why we're coming back in the end of August when we have the new forecast expected to be released on August 15th from our joint fiscal office to be able to make a budget that considers what that forecast looks like. So yes, hard decisions will lay ahead.
Eric, I think what I heard Eric asking was, we're all going to take a hit and we're all going to suffer in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. I think what he's asking is there will be any push from legislative leadership in Vermont to revisit the Vermont State Employees credit or contract. Will state employees take the same hit that I may take at my business? Will teachers who already have contracts and administrators who already have contracts be encouraged by any level of state government and state leadership to revisit their contracts? I mean, we're all going to hurt in 2020 and 21, and it seems like what I'm hearing is that anybody who already has a contract for 2020 is just going to sidestep any pain until the next contracts are negotiated.
Well, there's a few things in there. Yes, we're going to have to look at all the budgets. This pandemic has made a few things clear. One of them is that government's going to have to get used to living on a skinnier budget. And if for nothing else, if you look at the demographics, they all come home to roost as well. Where the highest earners by population are getting older and they're going to start earning less money. And it just feeds into the fact that we've got a fixed overhead that has to come down in expense. I'm not speaking for my fellow representatives, but so that has become clear from this in particular. And there's a lot of overlap amongst different state agencies. Stuff gets started up and it just exists, and they do the same things, and that they exist and they continue on. And so it's a difficult process. We've already begun some of that. Even in the commissions that exist, and trying to sunset different commissions, and it proves to be quite difficult to cancel something that's been started up, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But the governor had proposed that the schools go back to vote their school budgets and revisit their budgets with an 8% or 9% decrease, I think is what his request was, before August 5th, before the primary. And that was his suggestion at the time. And I think the legislature responded saying there's no way the schools can go back to the ballot box by August 11th. Is it August 11th, I think? and actually get that done. And the state, the Pay Act is coming up next week, in which there was a negotiated deal between the governor and the State Employees Credit Union, or State Employees Association, Vermont State Employees Association. And so that act is already in effect, has to be ratified by the legislature. We're going to be voting on that next week. So I'm not sure where the administration is on that. We haven't had a discussion in the legislature about that, but yeah, we're all going to suffer in many ways with this, and we'll be looking to make sure we have a very tight budget.
Yeah, and I appreciate those sentiments, and I think that, you know, as we look towards the summer or further on into the summer, if these, I'm just nervous that we're going to be pitting business against education.
Yeah, right.
In August, and that's a discussion that, I mean, as the leader of a business organization, I mean, you know, with people, you know, with 5 children, you know, I'm not anti-education, you know, so it's hard to, the concept of being pitted against education is not a palatable one.
No. I mean,
well, I was just going to add that with a small state of our population size with a finite budget, it's unfortunately, it's just not business versus education. It's business, social service, healthcare, environment, you name it, and business needs. It's what does all that look like that still enables us to live within our means, yet meet the needs of our society moving forward. It's going to be very difficult to make those decisions.
Thank you, Kari. Do any of our other business leaders from here in the Valley have any other questions that they'd like to ask at this point?
Yeah, I would just like to go back and pick up on a point you already addressed, Charlie, which was the partnerships, sole proprietors, if you like. And you indicated that the administration had asked for them to be excluded. Obviously, that's a big concern. Many of our lodging businesses in our chamber are, in fact, set up as partnerships. Eric and Willie are among them. And we just wanted to understand whether potentially in this second tranche you just voted for, was that restriction eliminated, or is there some workaround to allow them to be able to get some money from these relief packages?
It was not eliminated. And again, it was the request of the agency. The challenge was that in just sole proprietorships, there are 60,000 businesses that are sole proprietorships or with no employees. I am not sure, to be completely candid, as to how partnerships are viewed within that context. It says you do have to have an employee, but one employee. So if your partnership has one employee, you're good. But if it's just 2 of you with no employees, then that becomes a question that I don't know the answer to.
I think a good question might be, what is an employee? Is it your plowing contractor, or is it somebody who you're not paying a 1099?
Somebody for who you were filing a W-2, and yeah.
It's interesting because it falls in the sort of classic definition of a Vermont business, the mom and pop business. And so the agency has specifically said we don't like, you know, to help mom and pop businesses. It just seems to be, you know, reacting against, you know, apple pie. It's just such a strange exclusion.
I know Charlie and I, in fact, today we're talking about how we can craft an amendment to try to get that part of our bill that we voted on with respect to the CRF funds, and the information we see from the administration really prevented us from moving forward on that.
So I have a question about the grants for the creative community, which is wonderful because, you know, as a musician, I'm involved with 3 different orchestras here in Vermont, and
Wow.
I play violin. I'm always a promoter of the arts, and it's part of our culture here in Vermont as well as part of our economy. So it has a great impact. The grants that will be administered by the Vermont Arts Council, you said were going to be based on programming not not contributions. Is that correct? Because the reason I ask is, if you're an arts organization anywhere, especially in Vermont, if you're making 50% in earned revenue versus 50% in contributed revenue, then you're doing pretty well. Most organizations here exist on a majority of contributions and maybe a quarter of earned revenue through tickets and other sales like that. So I'm not sure how helpful that's going to be for a lot of organizations who don't make a lot of money selling tickets, but they do earn income from contributions. That's what they rely on, but they've not been able to, say, have fundraising events or house concerts or other things that bring people together to contribute their money. So just something to think about.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. Part of it was looking at the rules around COVID, around the funds from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. And there had to be a direct correlation between the loss of revenue or the business impact and the virus. And it wasn't clear that a lot of fundraising activities or grant or solicitation letters and that type of thing and soliciting charitable donations was directly, if there was a decrease, because it was directly related to the coronavirus. You raise a good point as to whether or not it is a dinner or something else or a function. But that's why a tax deductible contribution was excluded from it. So that if you're paying for typically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're holding an event for which you buy a ticket, you can't, that's not necessarily a tax deductible contribution.
Right. There's a part of it that you have to charge the market value of the dinner, for example, and then whatever the cost of the market values of the dinner is deducted from the whole check that was given to you. Yeah.
Yep. So I think there's some gray area there that has to be worked out because of that very thing. Yep.
Yep.
If there's any other questions, I don't want to go too long because I think if we go too much longer, we're going to lose all our viewers. As compelling as this is, I would really like to, before I go on, is there anyone else have any questions at this point? Because what I'd like to say is I really appreciate you being here, Charlie. You know, it's not your district. I know that you're working hard for all Vermonters, and I think that, and I know that Maxine and Kari, I know you're good people, and you're all good people, and that you're trying to do the right thing in a very tough situation, and being, you know, having to live by the rules of the federal government and this government, and I appreciate how much, you know, as you've said many times today, Charlie, is that how it's remarkable how quickly you are moving, and no matter how quickly you move, it's still not going to be fast enough for a lot of people. And I'm really grateful for the fact that within a couple of days I can call up our legislators and get you to be very forthcoming in this kind of a format. And I think we're fortunate to live in a state where that can happen. And I think that I think most people in this country are not that fortunate. And I don't think that the legislators are as responsive to the needs of their community and their constituents as we are here. So I do appreciate your time. I know that you care about our businesses, and I know that you care about our people here. And you know, hopefully we'll be able to invite you up here, Charlie, and you can come to Worthy Burger up here, or we can go down to yours in Woodstock and hopefully be able to, or we can meet in between in Royalton at some point.
Lawson's would be fine.
It.
Yeah.
Yes, you should know that I owe Charlie some Sip of Sunshine and maybe some collaborative. So it is
We know where
going
to get
cost me a bit, I think. But thank you.
And thank you, Eric, and thank all of you. And yes, we are so lucky to have Charlie with us today. And I think it it shows how we do work in the legislature in Vermont, that we really, we can't always know all the answers, and we tend to be experts in our own silos in our committees, but we do have friends in other committees, and we are really fortunate. And I do hope that this is the beginning of our conversation, and as people watch this, as things come up, as people call you, Eric, please funnel those questions to us, and
Yes.
we'll try to get you answers.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for participating. Does there anyone have any last comments at all?
Just wanted to add one comment. Number one, again, my thanks to all of you for participating. Certainly the additional package that you passed today addresses many of the concerns that we had been hearing. And so we really appreciate the legislature moving as quickly as they have on doing that. I think the one issue that is still going to be of concern out there is the partnership issue, and obviously you heard that. But thank you for moving so quickly on that second bill. And I think the key important thing now is anything that you can do to get the process such that the money gets out to businesses as quickly as possible, because as you've heard from Eric and Kurt, and I'm sure from many others directly, businesses are living almost day to day, if not week to week now, in terms of their cash situation and their ability to actually stay in business.
Yeah.
Right. And we do hope that people do go to the tax department website and sort of get, geared up, so that when those guidelines are in place, folks can get going.
Yeah, we absolutely, and we've sent that out to, as you know, you'll get our email updates, and we've been advising our members to do that since last weekend. So we really appreciate it. Yeah, yep.
I have just one final thing. First of all, thank you. I echo certainly what Eric and Peter said. I really, truly appreciate all you guys are doing each and every day. I know this has been difficult on everybody, and you guys are so committed to the local communities, that we all live in and work in. So I want to thank you for that. I did have just one other piece on the Department of Labor. We've had several employees just in the past couple of weeks actually get determinations of unemployment in the mail, even though they're still employed. So I wanted to make sure that you guys were aware that there is some fraud going on. It's been difficult at times to get through to the appropriate people within the fraud department, obviously, given just the overwhelming number of claims that they're working on. I was actually one of the people that got one of those notices, so I had to call our owner and say, "Hey, wow. Eric, am I still employed here?" And I was thankful it was me, because I was able to go through, work with our HR manager, as well as, reach out to the Department of Labor and some of the contacts I had, both on the employee side as well as on the employer side. But it is just a concern. And, what I found from, other companies in other states, that this is, Vermont, this isn't unique to Vermont, right? That this is a much broader thing. And I think sometimes, right, the challenge is that balance of getting money out quickly into people's hands, but also, right, balancing that with fraud prevention measures. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys were aware and it was on your radar, because I'd hate to see it impact too many other employees, especially in this time.
Yes, thank you. I put a notice on Front Porch Forum a couple of weeks ago. I'll revisit that and post that again. But yes, I've been trying to raise that awareness, in particular with respect to the unemployment insurance and the pandemic unemployment assistance program. But thank you for bringing that up.
Awesome, thank you.
I just want to say that points out to a natural tug and tension that we've had with unemployment insurance the whole time. It's like, get the checks out for a department that is always focused on preventing fraud. So it's to push them to get money out, and then it's a balance that they're trying to achieve. And I appreciate the delicacy of that. And thank you very much for having me. And I love to spend time with you and learn out what's going on. And you're ably represented in the legislature by two very talented people. And they're dedicated. I get emails from Kari at I think 12:30 and at night, and it's just, oh my God, Kari, go to bed.
You were up reading them.
I was up, but so you're ably represented.
Yeah. So on behalf of the business owners of the Meadow River Valley, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and I'd like to finish up by just thanking our business community for what they do to make the Chamber a viable organization. I have only been with this organization for about a year, and I was brought on for my marketing expertise, not my lobbying skills. And as a lot of businesses have had to pivot and do different things that are not necessarily in their wheelhouse, I have had to do that myself. And I just want to thank our business owners for continuing to support our Chamber of Commerce and enable me to still be here to help support them. So thank you. And as Kari said, let's continue this conversation, and maybe we'll catch you up, Charlie, and we can come up and do some skiing up in the bigger mountains up north one of these days.
Sounds good.
Take care, guys. Thanks for everything.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, have a
Take
great
care.
weekend.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.